It was in, I think, A Scandal in Bohemia that Sherlock Holmes first explains to Dr. Watson the difference in how each of them sees the world. It was one of those moments, of course, where Dr. Watson is completely just blown away by how Holmes can deduce things from seemingly nothing and figure something out. And so Sherlock Holmes says to him something along the lines of, the difference is that you see, but you do not observe. And he goes on to say, give him an example, and he says, for example, the number of steps up to the front door of our flat in Baker Street. How many are there? And Watson, of course, he has no idea. He just knows there's stairs there. And Holmes knows exactly how many steps there are. Off the top of my head, I can't remember how many, but still, Holmes knows. And not only does he know how many, he knows then, for example, how long it would take him to get from a cab in the street to their front door, or how quickly he could escape their flat if he needed to. It tells him things like, if a cab stops in front of their door, how long will it take the person in it to come upstairs? How much time does he have? And how long that person takes might also be determined with their ability to climb stairs. In other words, he extrapolates information from knowing almost nothing except what he observed. We're a lot of Watsons, aren't we? I think we are. I think the majority of people are Dr. Watsons in life. We see a lot, but we don't necessarily observe what's going on, and we don't necessarily get from that any information. Does anybody notice what was on the front step when you came in this morning? You notice what? You're just showing off, aren't you? Yes, you did notice. You did observe. There was chalk, sidewalk chalk, on the front step here. And it's there was names of kids and things, and that was from the kids program during the summer, right? So what might you then infer from that? Sorry? Oh, it hasn't rained on it. Okay, that's fair. But you might also infer, for instance, that there are children here. And that might be important because we let them sidewalk chalk on the front step. So they are important. If you're in Bashaw this morning, what does the sign say? No, wait, let me answer for you. You didn't notice, did you? I can't think of the number of times there's a sign in Bashaw that you can change out the front. And the number of times I've put something on that sign and asked people what it said and nobody had seen it. And yet they walked right by it. Here's the thing about all of that, though. Just because you didn't notice doesn't mean you're not aware. Because you didn't observe and then think something from that, it doesn't make you any less smart. Sometimes we read these stories, and here is one. Sometimes we read these stories in the Bible where, and I confess, I too sometimes think one of three things. Jesus is super patient, divinely so, in fact, or he does a lot of face palms. Or, like Sherlock Holmes, who is probably not either patient or does a lot of face palms, he understands that we don't necessarily always observe what's around us. It doesn't mean that we haven't seen it. Sometimes maybe we just need it pointed out. And here's a perfect example. The people in the story that we heard this morning that come to Jesus were the same people that the day before were with Jesus when the whole miracle of the loaves and fishes happened. And yet, what do they say to Jesus? Well, if you are who you say, and you're special and everything, give us a sign. Show us something. And either Jesus is really patient, or he went, oh man, or he understands. Now, to be honest, I sometimes, especially with the Gospel of John, I sometimes think these stories are made up for our benefit. That it maybe didn't happen exactly like this. The truth of the story is still there, but it may not have happened exactly like this. Because too often we read stories like this and think to ourselves, I'm sure we think to ourselves, man, those people are dense. They didn't get it. Yeah, they're not. They're just looking and seeing, but they're not observing what's going on. So they come to Jesus and they say, show us a sign. Rowan Atkinson, does everybody know who Rowan Atkinson is? No? Mr. Bean? Rowan Atkinson is a very funny British comedian who is most famous for Mr. Bean or Blackadder, but he does a lot of stand-up. And he once did a skit where he was a priest reading from Scripture, and he reads the story of the wedding in Cana in Galilee. You can find it on YouTube, and it's very funny. But he starts reading the story and how Jesus changed the water into wine. And he reads, and the people did not know whence the wine had come from. But then as he goes on, he goes, but the people in the kitchen knew, and they applauded loudly. And then they come out to Jesus and they say, do us another one. And so Jesus makes a carrot appear. And then he does some other tricks. And I think the thing about that story is you could think that's very irreverent, sacrilegious even. Or he points out a really interesting thing about how we hear those miracle stories. And this might be part of why the people came to Jesus and said, show us a sign. Is because in those days, if you wanted to prove that you were an important prophet and that you had power, you had to do one of two things. Your prophecy had to be true. That's a fairly fundamental piece of being prophetic. It had to come true. But the other is you had to do something. You had to give them a sign. You literally had to do a trick. And here are the people coming to Jesus and going, do a trick, prove it. Make some magic happen, and then we'll believe you. The same people who watched the crowd be fed, the same people who participated in the crowd being fed, the same people who watched Jesus heal people, maybe cast out a demon or two, the same people who listened to Jesus. They saw all that, and yet they still didn't understand. And you know they didn't understand because what story do they share with Jesus as a sign of you should do something for us, show us a sign. It's Moses feeding the Israelites in the desert. The story from Exodus, right? The people are in the wilderness, they're hungry, they complain to Moses, and Moses feeds them. So if Moses can do that, Jesus, you show us a sign. Except Moses didn't do that, as Jesus points out to them. Moses didn't feed the Israelites. God fed the Israelites. It wasn't Moses. It was through Moses, but it was God. In fact, if you read the story in Exodus, Moses frequently has to remind them that it wasn't him, that it's God that's doing that. And here's Jesus having to remind the crowd again, it's God that does those things. And the people are fed by the manna. So Jesus, pointing out to them that it's God that does that, goes on to say, he is the manna this time. He is the bread. I am the bread of life, Jesus says. Give us this bread always, say the people. And of course, I am the bread of life, Jesus says, all who come to me are fed. And your question then is, how? Isn't it? How? It's one thing to say, Jesus is the bread of life. Come unto me and you will be fed. But simply being here doesn't make you fed. You have to participate. You have to be part of that. Last week, this is not a test either, by the way, but last week, you may recall that I talked about church potlucks, and I loosely connected church potlucks to the story of the feeding of the 5,000. And part of the way that I did that was that I suggested that whichever miracle you think that feeding is, and it could be a miracle of the power of Jesus, or it could be a miracle of the power of Jesus, which is Jesus' power to inspire people to share and create community. And that's what a church potluck does. And there's always, as I said, there's always lots of food. There's always food left over. And the cool thing about that food that's left over is that sometimes it might go away with people who just really need food. Sometimes it might go home with the person who brought it. But either way, the next time you use those leftovers, you have an opportunity to go, hey, guess where these leftovers came from? And share a story. And that's how we're fed. And see, sometimes I say stuff like that, and I say, oh, we should have food at this, because it's a church thing. And it doesn't matter whether it's a potluck, or it's a church supper, or a pancake breakfast, or it's just coffee and cookies, or muffins, or whatever, or pie. Pie. I'm like Homer with donuts. It doesn't matter. We should have something. And people then sometimes say to me, I know it's obvious you like food, but do you guys do anything but eat at your church? Yes, we do. Yes, we very much do. But the thing is that, see, I think the story of the Last Supper, even this story of Jesus feeding the crowd, that's the tip of the foodberg in the Bible stories. Think of all of the stories that we hear of Jesus breaking bread with literally breaking bread with people. When the disciples see Jesus after the resurrection on the seashore, they don't recognize him until he does what? He breaks the bread with them. And I just wonder sometimes how many stories we didn't get. See, I think the people who wrote the Gospels, I think they left out a lot of stories because that story began with Jesus sat down for some food with some people and, oh, it's another food story, move on. Because Jesus knew that breaking bread with people is a time of sharing and creating community. It's a time of communicating. It's not just about the food that's on the table. It's about what happens in the sharing of that. It's about the communication that happens. The stories that are shared. It's not just about the bread. It's about the things that we learn in the sharing of that bread. Now, I said, I think, last week, that I think the miracle of that story of the feeding of the 5,000 is the miracle of the sharing, and then people went away to share that story. And yet, here's the crowd coming back to Jesus and going, give us more. When will we realize what it takes to be fed by the bread of life? What is it that truly feeds us as the bread of life? The story of Jesus and how Jesus shares with people and loves people and communicates with people, our example, literally, our example of living, is the bread that feeds us. And what's so amazing about that is that it doesn't just feed us. It feeds us and empowers us to feed others. And in the feeding of others, not only is Jesus' Spirit shared, but we are fed again. The leftovers aren't just the point where you say, here's some food that was left. Let me tell you the story about how I got this food. The leftover part is also, in the most positive sense, the leftover part is also how you are fed and then able to share because you have been fed. And what is it that feeds us? Acts of caring and kindness and love. Things that are true. Oh, how we need that these days. Acts that are true. So those two things go together, don't they? It's not just the spiritual, Jesus isn't just spiritual food. That spiritual food includes feeding people who are hungry, like physically hungry, finding a place for people who are homeless to live, giving water to those who are thirsty. Remember in, I'm going to say Matthew, because that's my favorite version. Jesus tells the people, this is when you have been like me. And it's when you have fed the hungry and clothed the naked, visited the sick and those in prison. And when you have done that to the least of these, you have done it for me. That is feeding people. I'm holding this piece of paper because I don't memorize well, at all, in fact. But one of my heroes is Desmond Tutu, and he has a wonderful way of saying this. He said, I don't preach a social gospel. I preach the gospel, period. The gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ is concerned for the whole person. When people were hungry, Jesus didn't say, now is that political or social? He said, I feed you. Because the good news to a hungry person is bread. Wholeness comes from more than just being spiritually fed. It comes from being physically, emotionally fed. And we do that when we live what Jesus teaches us to live. We do that when we feed the hungry and when we provide places to live for the homeless and give water to the thirsty, clothes to the naked. When we share like that, we create community. How often have you been to a potluck supper where literally every single person brought something? Probably never, because that's kind of the point of potluck, is you get what people bring. And sometimes people don't know that they were supposed to, or they forgot, or they just happened to be there and didn't know ahead of time. Whatever it is, there's always enough to feed everyone. And there always seems to be a little bit left over. The more I think about this potluck metaphor, it's not just about the creating community thing. It's not just about building, sharing and building community with people. It's a metaphor for the church. I mean, look at us. We're all different dishes, aren't we? Some of us are desserts. Some of us are appetizers. Some of us are entrees. Some of us are just like a pot of potatoes. Together, we create something. We create that community, that potluck community, where people can feel like they belong. And everything is shared. And from it, we are fed, not only spiritually, not only mentally, but our hearts are fed to go and share with others. We are inspired to action. That's what it means to be truly fed. Jesus telling these people that he is the bread of life. Right after they've quoted to him the story of the manna in the wilderness. It was God who gave the manna that fed the people and sustained them. It's God who gives Jesus that love and caring for us to share that feeds us, that we can share with others and build community. Not just as a church community, as a faith community, but as a world community. That's what it means to be the bread of life.